in a staggering diplomatic explosion that has shattered 5 decades of alliance politics. 5 world leaders have walked out of the G7 summit, not over trade, climate, or defense, but because the President of the United States physically barred the Prime Minister of Canada from entering a working session, and then declared the forum America's Table. The summit, hosted in a luxury resort on the shores of Lake Biarritz, was in its second day. The morning session was meant to focus on global economic coordination, supply chains, currency stability, the mundane but vital machinery of Western cooperation. But at 8:45 a.m., Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and his delegation arrived at the session room to find the door blocked. 2 American security officials and a White House advance team delivered the message: the Prime Minister would not be participating, no prior notice, no diplomatic protocol, no mechanism invoked, just a flat refusal. Carney and his team were left standing in the corridor, watching through glass walls as other leaders took their seats. Inside, when the session began, President Trump addressed the remaining 5 leaders, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the United Kingdom, with the press pool recording every word. Canada is not participating today, he said. Frankly, Canada has not been a productive member of this group for some time, as long as the current Canadian leadership continues to undermine American economic interests. The United States sees no reason to include them in these discussions. This is our table. We built it, and we decide who sits at it. Those 3 sentences, our table, we built it, we decide who sits, claimed unilateral American ownership of a multilateral institution founded on sovereign equality. In an instant, the G7 was no longer a partnership. It was property, and every leader in that room understood the message: your seat exists because America permits it. But what the president did not know was that those leaders had already seen this coming. Behind the scenes for 36 hours, Trump had been trying to build a coalition to exclude Canada. At the traditional leaders' dinner on the first evening, he approached the French president during a cocktail reception and suggested that Canada's trade posture was making the G7 unproductive. The French president's reply, overheard by 2 officials, was a single sentence: the G7 is not a reward for compliance. Trump then moved to Japan's prime minister, receiving a polite but unmistakable no. He went to the UK's prime minister, who told him any change to G7 membership required consensus, including Canada's. 3 attempts, 3 refusals. And yet the next morning, Trump acted alone, having failed to win support legitimately. He simply barred Carney anyway. That detail, that Trump had asked each leader for permission and been denied, then did it unilaterally, raced through the delegations in the hours before the session. It transformed the exclusion from a bilateral dispute into an assault on the institution itself. Trump had not just overruled Canada, he had overruled every leader who had told him no. For 11 minutes, the session continued as if nothing had happened. But the French president, whose name diplomatic sources now say will be taught in academies for a century, was running what one aide called the fastest and most consequential cost-benefit analysis in French diplomatic history. He was not defending Canada. He was defending France. If an American president could unilaterally exclude a member and the room accepted it, why not France tomorrow? Why not any nation that disagrees with Washington? Then he moved. He pushed back his chair, the sound of wood on wood, amplified by the room's acoustics, cutting through the murmur like a gunshot. He stood. He did not look at Trump. He looked at the other 4 leaders still seated: Germany, Japan, Italy, the United Kingdom. And he spoke 31 words, not to the American president, but to the room. If one of us can be removed from this table by another, then none of us are seated here by right. We are seated here by permission, and I did not come to the G7 to sit at anyone's permission. Then he turned and walked toward the door. He did not hurry. He did not look back. What happened next lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and will be studied for generations as the most rapid institutional collapse in modern diplomacy. Germany's chancellor stood before the French president had even reached the door. She said nothing. She gathered her papers, placed them in a folder with cold precision, pushed back her chair and followed. 12 German officials along the back wall rose in unison, a choreographed response that suggested Berlin had already decided its line. 4 seconds later, Japan's prime minister stood. His delegation scrambled to follow. At the door, he paused, turned, and bowed slightly toward the room, a gesture of Japanese formality that, in this context, felt less like courtesy and more like farewell. Italy's prime minister stood next, placing a hand briefly on the table as he rose, a gesture one Italian journalist later described as a man saying goodbye to a piece of furniture that had meant something to him. And then the United Kingdom's prime minister, leader of America's so-called special relationship partner, the ally historically aligned with Washington more closely than any other, stood. He looked at Trump for a brief moment. Every camera captured that silence. It contained an entire recalculation of 80 years of strategic alignment. Then he walked out. Within 3 minutes and 40 seconds, the G7 had lost 5 of its 7 members. The table that had hosted 51 years of multilateral cooperation through oil crises, financial meltdowns, the end of the Cold War, the rise of China, a global pandemic, was empty. One man sat alone. The cameras kept rolling. Trump sat in silence for approximately 90 seconds, looking at the door, looking at the empty chairs, saying something to an aide that microphones did not pick up. He adjusted his jacket, looked at the door again, then stood and left through a different exit, flanked by Secret Service, avoiding the hallway where, on the other side of the glass wall, the 5 leaders who had walked out were already gathering. That hallway became the story within the story. The 5 leaders did not return to their separate suites. They did not issue individual statements. They gathered spontaneously in the corridor, visible through the glass walls to every camera still positioned inside. Within minutes, they were joined by Mark Carney, who had been waiting in the Canadian delegation's holding room when word reached him of what had happened. Handshakes were visible, body language unmistakable. 6 leaders standing in a corridor, engaged in warm, animated conversation. While inside the room they had just left, a single empty table testified to the cost of what had driven them out. A journalist asked Carney what he was feeling. He looked at the 5 leaders around him, paused, and said, "I'm not the story. They are." Then he gestured to the 5 and stepped to the side, physically removing himself from the center of the cluster, ceding the visual and the narrative to the allies who had sacrificed their seats to defend a principle: restraint as power. The summit's remaining sessions were canceled. The joint communiqué, the consensus document that every G7 summit has produced since the institution's founding, was abandoned for the first time in 51 years. The host nation tried to convene an informal working lunch. 5 delegations declined. Instead, the 6 leaders issued their own statement. The undersigned leaders affirm the principle of sovereign equality as the foundation of multilateral cooperation and reject any unilateral assertion of authority over the membership or proceedings of the G7. Signed by France, Germany, Japan, Italy, the United Kingdom, and Canada. The United States was not asked to sign. Within 72 hours, the conversation about the future of the G7 had shifted from theoretical to operational. The French president hosted a conference call with the 5 leaders who had walked out plus Carney. Officials in 3 capitals described the options being discussed. Continuing the G7 with a rotating chair to prevent any single nation from controlling the agenda, expanding the group to include Australia, South Korea, and India to dilute American dominance, or the option that sent shockwaves through Washington, proceeding as a G6 without the United States, at least until American leadership demonstrated a commitment to multilateral equality. The G6 option was supported by at least 3 of the 6 leaders and seriously considered by the remaining 3. 51 years of American centrality in the world's most exclusive economic forum, and 3/4 of the membership was now weighing whether the institution would function better without its founding member. The damage cascaded beyond the G7 itself. European leaders began asking whether American unilateralism at the summit reflected a pattern extending to NATO, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and World Bank, every institution where American leadership had historically been assumed rather than earned. Japan's prime minister reportedly said during the call, "The rules-based international order cannot depend on a single nation's willingness to follow the rules." Diplomatic observers noted that was the strongest public statement from a Japanese leader about American conduct since the end of the Second World War. The UK's prime minister, whose country's strategic posture has been anchored in the Anglo-American special relationship for 80 years, said something British analysts described as seismic. The special relationship is valuable, but it is not more valuable than the principle that multilateral institutions belong to their members collectively, not to their most powerful member individually. Markets responded with cold clarity. The dollar weakened against a basket of G7 currencies, as traders repriced the probability that American-led economic frameworks would remain stable. Bond yields moved in ways suggesting institutional investors were modeling a future where multilateral economic coordination no longer centered on Washington. 3 major investment banks issued notes within 48 hours warning clients that G7 institutional risk was now a factor in long-term portfolio construction. A Deutsche Bank strategist wrote a sentence quoted in every financial publication by the end of the week. The G7 was the last multilateral institution where American leadership was unquestioned. That is no longer the case. The repricing of American institutional centrality has only begun. Domestically, the reaction split along a fault line. Trump posted on social media that the walkout proved these countries don't respect strength, and that the G7 needs America more than America needs the G7. His base rallied behind the framing of American dominance, reasserted, weak allies who could not handle strong leadership, a president willing to stand alone, because standing alone is what strength looks like. But the foreign policy establishment, Republican and Democratic, military and civilian, reacted with something closer to grief. A former Secretary of State said, "The G7 was built by American diplomacy. It was sustained by American leadership, and it was just destroyed by American arrogance. That is a loss that will take a generation to repair, if it can be repaired at all." A retired four-star general said on cable news, "I have spent 40 years working within the alliance framework that the G7 sits at the top of. What I watch today is the visible collapse of American convening authority, the ability to bring allies to a table and keep them there. Once that authority is gone, it does not come back. It depends on trust. And trust, once broken at this level, does not heal." Republican senators on the Foreign Relations Committee demanded an emergency briefing within 48 hours. 3 of them issued a joint statement remarkable for what it refused to say. It called for a reassessment of the approach to multilateral engagement without once mentioning the president's name, a diplomatic silence that in Washington's grammar is louder than any accusation. The Business Roundtable warned that the institutional architecture of global economic cooperation is a strategic asset that took decades to build and cannot be rebuilt once dismantled. Fortune 500 CEOs privately communicated to the White House through intermediaries that the walkout had materially damaged the predictability of the international business environment. One CEO, speaking anonymously to the Financial Times, said, "My company operates in every G7 country. I need those governments to coordinate on regulation, trade standards, financial policy." The president just blew up the forum where that coordination happens. He didn't ask me, he didn't ask any of us. And we are the ones who will pay for it, not in political capital, but in actual capital, for decades. The photograph that emerged from that morning, Donald Trump sitting alone at a circular table designed for 6 empty chairs arranged around him, 6 flags standing behind 6 absent leaders, was published on the front page of every major newspaper on Earth. Editorial cartoonists across 4 continents published variations within 24 hours, every cartoon legible without a caption. The image was projected onto buildings in 3 European capitals by activist groups. It appeared on the cover of The Economist with the single-word headline, "Alone." It was shared without comment by heads of state who are not even G7 members. India's prime minister, Brazil's president, South Africa's president. Late-night television hosts opened their shows with the photograph. Social media accounts dedicated to diplomatic history called it the most significant image in multilateral diplomacy since the founding photograph of the United Nations. The image did not depict a policy failure. It depicted something more fundamental, a leader who had chosen dominance over partnership and the empty room that dominance produces. So here is where we stand. The President of the United States unilaterally barred the Prime Minister of Canada from a G7 working session, told the remaining leaders that the G7 is America's table, and watched as 5 of those leaders, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the United Kingdom, rose from their chairs and walked out in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The summit collapsed. The communiqué was abandoned for the first time in 51 years. The 6 leaders who left issued a joint statement affirming sovereign equality. Formal discussions about proceeding as a G6 without the United States are underway. The French president stood in a room full of the world's most powerful leaders and said 31 words that are now on the front page of every major newspaper on Earth. "If one of us can be removed from this table by another, then none of us are seated here by right. We are seated here by permission. And I did not come to the G7 to sit at anyone's permission."